Hello class, I'm Dr. Su, the instructor of the course. Today, the class will discuss the chapter 8 of the textbook, The Perfect Comparative Market. Here is the order of video clips. 1. Examining shifts in short-run market supply. 2. Deriving long-run market supply. 3. Examining the firm's short-run and long-run adjustment. For marginal revenue and profit maximization for a competitive market. 5. Efficiency in competitive markets. 6. Efficiency in different market structures. 7. Shutdown rule. 8. Short run to long run in competitive markets. Here is the first video clip.
There was a lot to cover in this diagram, and I find that when I give this explanation, students always have questions. I'm going to try to anticipate some of your questions and answer them in this segment. The first question that students often ask is, what causes the short-run supply curve to shift? What causes this green curve to change its position? What leads to a larger quantity of output at any given price? Now, over on the board, I have redrawn the short-run supply curve by itself. And I'm going to talk about the things that would cause the short-run supply curve to change its position. In particular, let's talk about what would cause it to shift outwards. To answer this question, start with recalling what the short-run supply curve is. The short-run supply curve is the sum of all of the firm's individual short-run marginal cost curves above the shutdown point. If you take all of the firms that are in the market at a given time and you add up their short-run supply curves, that is the amount of output they will produce at a particular price, you get the short-run supply curve for the market. It's the sum of the individual firms' short-run supply curves above the shutdown point. Now, what would cause those curves to shift outwards? Well, there are two things that would cause this shift to happen. First would be a change within the firms that are producing currently. The second would be adding more firms. Either of those would cause the curve to shift. Let's start with a change in the existing firms. Suppose the existing firms suddenly have a shift from a few trucks in the short run to a lot of trucks in the long run. If the existing firms acquire more capital, then the marginal product of labor is going to change. If you have 5 workers working with a single truck, the marginal product of labor is going to be very low. But if you have 5 workers working with 3 trucks, then the marginal product of labor is going to be high. Remember, the marginal cost of production is the reciprocal of the marginal product of labor. So when a firm gets more capital, when a firm moves from the short run to the long run and is able to acquire more trucks, then the marginal product of labor increases. And as the marginal product of labor increases, the marginal cost of production decreases. So we could show it this way. We're moving from one set of short-run marginal cost curves with only a few trucks to another set of short-run marginal cost curves that have more trucks. And in that case, the marginal cost of production is going to be lower. It's like we're moving from this particular set of marginal cost curves to this other set of marginal cost curves that are further up the long-run average cost curve that have a lower marginal cost because the marginal product of labor is higher. Now, that's a roundabout way of saying that one thing that can shift out the short-run supply curve is if the existing firms get more capital. As we move from the short run to the long run, the short run supply curve will move outwards because the existing firms may acquire more capital. And when they acquire more capital, labor becomes more productive and the marginal cost falls for the individual firms. All right, that's reason number one. Short run supply curve shifts outward if the existing firms get more capital. The second reason that the short run supply curve will shift outward is adding more firms. In the long run, when there's free entry, the existence of profit in this market will attract new firms into the industry. When new firms are attracted into the industry, those new firms add their short-run supply curves to the market. And that causes the market short-run supply curve to shift outwards. It shifts outwards because we are adding new firms. It's that simple. So what causes the green curve to shift around? There are two things. The first is a change in the fixed inputs of our given firms, our existing firms. The second is adding new firms. You can consider the process in reverse. If firms leave the market, the short-run supply curve shifts inward. And if firms cut back on their capital, that is, in the long run, when they're able to lay off some of their trucks or sell them or return them to the people from whom they've rented them, then the capital stock shrinks. And when the capital stock shrinks, the marginal productivity of labor falls and the marginal cost rises again. So the same two ideas are at work, whether the curve is shifting outward or inward. A change in the capital stock changes marginal product, and that changes marginal cost. That's reason number one. And a change in the number of firms causes the short-run supply curve to shift. That's reason number two. This is the last lecture in our series on productivity, costs, and profits. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the effects of the expansion of an industry, and we'll be deriving a tool that we call the long-run supply curve. Let's start with revisiting the relationship between the market and the individual firm that we derived last time. So here we have the market equilibrium, the demand curve, which is the behavior of households and consumers, and the short-run supply curve, which is the sum of the marginal cost curves of the individual firms. In the short run, the supply curve and the demand curve intersect and give us an equilibrium point. We'll call this P0, and the market quantity, we'll call this Q0. Now, if we take this price over into the diagram for the individual firm, we see that in long-run equilibrium, the firm is making zero economic profit, and the firm is producing at the point of efficient scale. This is a long-run equilibrium. The only way we can have a long-run equilibrium is if no firm wants to change its behavior. In this case, the firm is maximizing profit by producing where price is equal to marginal cost. And the firm is breaking even by producing where price is equal to average cost. There is zero economic profit, and therefore no tendency for entrance or exit. Everything is stable in this market. Let's upset the equilibrium now by changing the demand for the product. If we change the demand for the product, and the demand curve shifts up to this new point D prime, then we have an excess demand for the product at the old price. And the bidding mechanism then will push the price up so that firms supply a larger quantity and the quantity demanded decreases, so that the price goes up to this point here. Now that would be the short-run equilibrium, and the firm would move along its short-run marginal cost curve over here in this diagram. I'm not going to draw the short-run marginal cost because my focus here is on a different story. I want to know what happens as new firms enter the market? What happens to the costs of production? As new firms enter the market and the short-run supply curve shifts outwards, representing an increase in the number of firms offering trucking services, it may be that as these new firms enter the market, that they drive up the cost of production for all firms. Suppose that truck drivers are in short supply. If truck drivers are in short supply, then as trucking companies try to expand their operations, they're going to be bidding up the salaries of truck drivers. And as the salaries of truck drivers rise, then the costs of production for every firm in the trucking industry are going to increase. When this happens, the cost curves shift upward, and the cost that firms can afford to operate at will be rising. That is, the point of minimum long-run average cost will be shifting upwards. So what we have then, as the short-run supply curve shifts outwards and firms enter the industry and compete for a strictly limited resource like talented truck drivers, the costs of production will shift upwards, and we will get something like this. A new long-run average cost curve at a higher level. If expansion in an industry causes the cost curves to shift upward like this, we say that this is an increasing cost industry. If the expansion of the industry causes the cost curves to shift upwards, we call it an increasing cost industry. What we're saying is, as the industry expands, competition for a strictly limited resource will in fact increase the costs of all firms in the industry. This was the case in the computer industry in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when there was a limited supply of talented computer programmers. It took a while for students to go to school and learn computer programming, and of course those students were attracted by the promise of higher salaries. But in the short run, as computer companies tried to expand their operation, competing for a pool of talented programmers, they pushed up programmers' salaries through competition, and that raised the cost of production for all of the companies. Now, what does this mean? It means that there will be a limited amount of entry before the price falls to the point at which firms can just afford to cover their costs. The break-even point for firms has shifted upward as the cost of production has increased. That means the price for the product cannot fall back to its original level, but can only fall as low as the new point of minimum average cost. That new point of minimum average cost might be not 8 cents a mile for trucking service, but 12 cents a mile for trucking service. The increase in costs limits the amount by which the short-run supply curve can shift outwards. This new price, P1, has to be the new equilibrium price. It's the new price that's given by the intersection of short-run supply and demand. It's the new price that we have in long-run equilibrium. Firms are breaking even, and the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. If I connect these two dots, I get what we call in economics the long-run supply curve. The long-run supply curve shows what happens to minimum average cost as an industry expands. In our case, we were talking about an increasing cost industry. When an increasing cost industry expands, the minimum average cost of production rises as firms compete for a strictly scarce resource and push up the costs of production. The long-run supply curve in this case is upward sloping. It is possible that you have what's called a constant cost industry. A constant cost industry would be one where, as the industry expands, the costs of production do not change for the individual firms. In that case, the short-run supply curve would keep shifting outward until our price fell back to 8 cents per mile, the original minimum long-run average cost. In that case, the long-run supply curve would be a horizontal line. The short-run supply curve would keep shifting out until it intersected the demand curve at the original price, the original minimum long-run average cost. One more possibility: what if the expansion of an industry actually decreases the cost of production for individual firms? What if we have a decreasing cost industry? What if a large number of firms in an industry actually lowers the cost for each firm in that industry? That could be the case, say, in software design, where you have a bunch of software engineers who work in a market, and with more people trying to solve the same kinds of problems, they're able to solve them faster. They share ideas. Everyone's working on the same problem, and therefore it takes less time to solve it. In an industry like that, a large number of talented software designers lower the cost for each other by working on common problems and sharing insights with each other. That leads to what's called a decreasing cost industry. As the industry expands, the cost of production actually fall. And in that case, the long-run supply curve would be downward sloping. So, a quick summary. The long-run supply curve tells us about the relationship between the size of an industry and the cost of production for an individual firm in that industry. If expansion of the industry pushes up costs for individual firms, we call it an increasing cost industry, and the long-run supply curve slopes upwards. That will be the case if expansion in the industry heats up competition for a strictly scarce resource, like talented programmers or certified truck drivers. It's also possible that expansion of the industry leaves costs unchanged. That's what we call a constant cost industry, and that would give us a long-run supply curve that's horizontal. Finally, it could be that expansion of an industry actually reduces costs for the individual firms. This would be the case if growth in the industry allowed communication among the participants or other ways of economizing on costs, external economies of scale, we call it sometimes in economics, where the growth of an industry lowers costs for everyone. In that case, the long-run supply curve will be downward sloping. A trucking firm, and you suddenly discover that you can charge more for your trucking services than you were able to before. How would you change your operation? And how would your response in the short run differ from your response in the long run? In this lecture, we're going to answer that question, and we're going to do it first by drawing out all of the cost curves that we've studied up to this point. Then we're going to look at how the firm maximizes its profits in the short run when it can make a small adjustment, and in the long run when it can make a large adjustment. Let's draw first the cost curves that will be associated with the firm's choice, and I'll start with the long-run cost curve. I'll first draw the long-run average cost curve, and the long-run average cost curve, I'll draw it with its usual U shape. This long-run average cost curve tells us about the firm's scale economies. Increasing returns to scale when long-run average cost is downward sloping, constant returns to scale at the bottom of the curve, and decreasing returns to scale when long-run average cost is increasing. And I'll label the curve LRAC, long-run average cost. Now, of course, associated with the long-run average cost curve is the long-run marginal cost curve. And the long-run marginal cost curve tells us about the cost of increasing the firm's output in the long run when the firm can achieve the cost minimizing technique. Remember, the long-run curves, the blue curves, always represent the firm's possibilities when it can combine capital and labor in whatever proportions it wants. That is, the blue curves represent costs when the firm can get to the cost minimizing technique, the cost minimizing combination of capital and labor. So let me label this curve long run marginal cost, or LMC. Let's suppose now that the firm is facing a price that's equal to P sub 0 for its trucking services. Maybe this is 8 cents a mile, and that's what the firm is able to charge right now for providing its trucking services to its customers. What would the firm do in the long run if it could sell its services at 8 cents a mile? How many miles worth of trucking services would the firm choose to offer? The answer, as always, is find the place where price is equal to marginal cost. So follow the price line horizontally across the diagram until we get to price equals marginal cost, until we get to the long-run marginal cost curve. If the price had been higher, say at a price way up here, then the firm would have gone over to a point like this on its long-run marginal cost curve. If the price had been lower, say down here, then the firm would have looked for a point like this. The firm always seeks to make price equal to marginal cost as it tries to maximize its profits. And in the long run, that means being where the price touches the long-run marginal cost curve. Now notice, I've set up this example in a special way. I wanted to make sure that the firm was operating here at the bottom of its long-run average cost curve. That is, it turns out that this firm happens to be at Y sub E, the point of efficient scale. In our previous example, this was 50,000 miles a day of trucking services provided, with 20 trucks and 30 drivers. This is the situation at which the firm maximizes its profits. How much profit is the firm making in this case? I'll give you some options to choose from, and you pick the correct one. Looking at this diagram, in the long run, how much profit is the firm making? The answer is the firm is making zero economic profit because the price of its service is exactly equal to the average cost of providing the service. The firm is breaking even. If the price were higher, the firm would be making a positive economic profit. If the price were lower, the firm would be making an economic loss. But as it is, when the firm is operating at the point of efficient scale, the firm is making zero economic profit. The firm is breaking even. It's making just enough money to cover the opportunity costs of all of the resources that it's using to produce its trucking services. Now, let's consider the short run. Suppose this firm wants to alter its pattern of production in the short run. Remember, the short run is the period of time over which the number of trucks is fixed. We've got a firm with 20 trucks, and it wants to change the number of trucking services that it provides, or the number of miles that it travels, but it can only do so by changing its labor input. It cannot change the number of trucks it uses in the short run. So I'll use my green curve here to represent short run costs, and in this case I'll get another U-shaped curve, and this U-shaped curve will be the average total cost curve for the short run. Now, where did I get this average total cost curve? I held constant the number of trucks the firm used, equal to 20, and I modified labor in order to produce extra quantities of trucking services. If the firm wants to run more routes and provide more service, it's got to hire more drivers and use those trucks more intensively. Or it wants to cut back its output, it's going to have to lay off workers, but it's still stuck with the trucks. So here's the average total cost curve associated with changing output in the short run when you've got 20 trucks. And 20 trucks is the number of trucks that minimizes costs for providing 50,000 miles of service a day. So let's put a little note on here. We'll call this average total cost, and I'll just make it understood that this is the average total cost that's associated with having the number of trucks that's cost minimizing for the point of efficient scale. So in our case, that's 20 trucks in my story. Also, there's a marginal cost curve that's going to cut through this average total cost curve, and it's going to cut through it at its bottom. We know from our previous lecture that the bottom of this curve will also be the bottom of the long-run average cost curve. So there's going to be here an intersection that involves four curves touching at once. And here's the short-run marginal cost curve. And let me put SMC here, where the short-run marginal cost curve is the one that's associated with the point of efficient scale. Well, I've got two more questions to answer before I feel like this diagram really makes sense. The first one is, why can you be sure that the green average total cost curve is everywhere above the blue long-run average cost curve? Why is the average total cost in the short run always higher than the long-run average cost? You give the answer. The answer is, in the long run, the firm can always change capital and labor both in order to get to the cost minimizing technique. In the short run, the firm does not have that flexibility. It can only modify its labor input. It can only change one input. Therefore, the costs are always higher in the short run because you can't get to that cost minimizing technique. In the long run, of course, you can. So the costs of production are always lower in the long run. Next question. How can I be sure that the short-run marginal cost curve lies above the long-run marginal cost curve? Why does this short-run marginal cost curve go above the blue long-run marginal cost curve when my firm expands its output? The answer is, in the short run, if you want to expand, you can only do so by hiring extra labor. In the long run, if you want to expand, you can hire more labor and more capital and do so in the combination that minimizes the cost of expansion. See, if you can't get more trucks, you may have to use a whole lot more workers than you'd otherwise like to, just to use those trucks more productively, or really load workers in so they're always running at maximum peak productivity. However, in the long run, when you can modify both workers and trucks, you have the flexibility to combine them to find lower cost ways of expanding your output. In the long run, you have more options, and more options equals lower cost of expansion. Now, here's one more point, and this point's kind of subtle. So if I don't make it clearly enough for you the first time, don't worry about it and just go on. But give it a shot and see if this works. If we reduce our output, why is it in the short run that costs will be reduced less than they will be in the long run? If we cut back our output from 50,000 miles of trucking service down to 40,000 miles of trucking service, how can you be sure that in the short run our costs will fall less than they would fall in the long run? The answer is, in the short run, when we try to cut back our output, we can only lay off workers. We can only reduce the labor input. And we may have to only lay off 2 or 3 workers before we've got trucks that, can't be used productively. We've got to be careful in the short run about how many workers we lay off, or our output could start to fall very rapidly. In the long run, however, if we want to cut back our services, we can lay off both labor and capital and lay them off in those combinations that allow us to maximize our cost savings. In the short run, we have less flexibility, and less flexibility always means less cost savings when you're trying to reduce your output and cut back. In the long run, whenever you can both lay off workers and reduce capital input, then you get bigger cost savings. Your marginal cost is higher. That means you can lower your costs faster, or faster is the wrong word. You can lower your costs by more if you have more time to adjust both inputs than if you can only make one adjustment, that is, adjusting labor. All right, so what I've done here is I've explained this important point of intersection. I've explained why the green curves are above the blue curves, and we've discussed this particular point of efficient scale. Now we're ready to do an experiment. Suppose instead of 8 cents per mile, our firm is suddenly able to charge a higher price, maybe due to increased demand for trucking services. If that's the case, then what happens is the firm now faces a higher price for its product. And with a higher price for its product, the firm is going to want to expand its output. Let's figure out now what the firm is going to do in the short run. In the short run, with this higher price, the firm would like to get a piece of this action, expand its services. However, it's limited in the short run. What's its limitation? It can't get more trucks. It can only expand its output by hiring more workers and crowding more workers into the trucks to try to use those trucks more productively, keeping them running all the time, scheduling workers between trucks so that the trucks are never idle. In the short run, we can only get increased output by expanding the variable input, labor. That means we're going to be on the green curves in the short run. So where's the firm going to go? How much extra output will the firm produce in the short run with this higher price? Locate the point in the diagram that represents maximum profit in the short run. The answer is follow the price over to the short run marginal cost curve, and that gives you the profit maximizing output in the short run. What's going to be happening? The firm is going to be trying to provide more trucking services by using more workers, hiring more workers. Instead of running one-person crews, we may have two-person crews, two drivers in a single truck, so that the truck is used more productively and we get a few extra miles out of it every day. We may have more workers working between trucks, 8 hours in one, 8 hours in another. The firm may incur the extra cost of flying workers around so that they meet up with trucks that need a replacement driver. All that stuff will happen. And what's going to happen when we start crowding more workers into our given number of trucks? What's going to start happen when we start packing more workers into those 20 trucks is that labor productivity continues to fall. And as it does, the marginal cost of production rises. See, this is how it works. The higher price gives the trucking firm the latitude or the flexibility to hire the extra workers that push up marginal cost. Those extra workers are expensive, and getting extra miles out of your given fleet of trucks means using labor packed into trucks at a higher labor-truck ratio, and that's going to lower labor productivity. As labor productivity falls, the cost of production rises, and if it weren't for this higher price, the trucking company couldn't afford to pack workers into trucks the way they're doing. But the higher price encourages the trucking company to hire the extra workers in the short run. So output increases, and output increases maybe to, let's say, to 50,000 or 55,000 miles of trucking service provided a day. So we get a new higher output, and we'll call this new higher output Y1S. So in the short run, we get an increase of output. Now in the long run, what's going to happen? Oh, by the way, notice also, is the firm making a profit in the short run? Sure they are. Go from the price down to the short run average cost, the average total cost in the short run, and this gap right here, multiplied by the number of miles of service provided, is the firm's profit in the short run. There's a short run profit because price is greater than average total cost, as we see by looking at the difference between price and the average total cost curve above 55,000 miles. What's going to happen in the long run? In the long run, of course, the firm is going to say, look, if we can charge 10 cents a mile for our service, we're going to get a bigger fleet of trucks. And as the firm employs a bigger fleet of trucks, they're going to find it optimal to change their labor to match the bigger fleet, and they're going to find the cost-minimizing technique for providing a larger quantity of service, for serving more miles a day. So as we move from the green curve to the blue curve in the long run, the firm is changing both labor input and capital input, more trucks and more drivers. Changing the two in whatever combination gives us the minimum cost of providing that quantity of service. So notice in the long run, the firm will end up producing more output than they do in the short run. Because in the long run, the firm has more flexibility and they're going to be able to make more profit. Notice profit is bigger in the long run because costs in the long run are always lower. This gap is bigger in the long run than it is in the short run. So in the long run, when the firm is able to modify both its capital input and its labor input, the firm does two things. It produces a larger quantity of output, and it makes a bigger profit. It's always good to have the flexibility that comes with the long run, because in the long run, you can modify both capital and labor in order to achieve the cost-minimizing technique. And anytime your costs are lower, you're probably going to want to expand your output. So, quick review. I started with the short and the long run cost curves together in one diagram, and I discussed the relationship among these curves, what determines their positions relative to each other. Then I did an experiment. I raised the price that our trucking company can charge for its services from 8 cents a mile to 10 cents a mile. And I looked at the response of the trucking company in the short run and the long run. In the short run, the trucking company can only expand its output by hiring more workers. So it does so, but the costs rise very rapidly because labor productivity declines quickly if we've got to keep packing workers into the same old trucks. In the long run, however, costs rise more slowly because the firm can modify both its capital and its labor. It can get more trucks and more drivers. So because it takes longer for the costs to catch up, the firm is able to increase its output more in the long run because it takes a bigger range of output for the marginal cost to catch up with the price. In the long run, the firm produces more output and the firm makes a bigger profit. In the next lecture, we'll look at how a single firm responds to a change in the market.
In previous lessons, we have gone over extensively how a firm's short-run costs of production are determined by the law of diminishing marginal returns. In today's video lesson, we're going to talk about revenues. As you may know, a firm in a market economy, generally speaking, is interested in maximizing its profits. And any firm interested in maximizing profits must take into account both its revenues and its costs. Revenues and costs are how a firm determines whether or not it is earning profits. In fact, total profit is simply a function of total revenues and total costs. So, a firm's total revenues minus its total costs tell us the firm's level of economic profit. Now, in our graphs of a firm's short-run cost of production, we generally don't illustrate total revenues and total costs. Rather, what we focus on is per unit costs and per unit revenues. So in our previous lessons, we've shown how a firm's per unit costs, including its marginal costs, its average variable and average total costs, are determined. In this lesson, we're going to focus on revenues. How is a firm's revenues determined in the short run? And we're going to start by looking at a perfectly competitive firm. Let's go over quickly a few of the characteristics of perfect competition. Firstly, a perfectly competitive market is one with many sellers. Many sellers, meaning maybe even hundreds or thousands of sellers. There has to be a large number of firms in order for a market to be considered perfectly competitive. Secondly, each of these sellers has identical costs. Each seller is the same. This is a very broad assumption. We're assuming that there is no different levels of costs among the sellers in a perfectly competitive market. In addition to facing identical costs, perfectly competitive firms have homogeneous products. In other words, the output is all the same. Every firm sells an identical product to every other firm. Next, perfectly competitive markets have low entry barriers. This will be very important when we discuss the possibility of perfectly competitive firms earning long-run economic profits. Due to the low barriers to entry, new firms can enter a perfectly competitive market or exit a perfectly competitive market very easily. Next, as we're going to see, perfectly competitive firms are what we call price takers. This means that any individual firm in a perfectly competitive market has little or no control over the price at which they can sell their products. That price is determined in the market for the product, in which thousands of identical firms are selling identical products. Lastly, based on all of these other characteristics identified above, we're going to see that perfectly competitive firms will earn no economic or abnormal profits in the long run. So these are our characteristics of perfect competition. I'm going to move these up here so that we can conduct some analysis based on our assumptions about the perfectly competitive market and the perfectly competitive firm. So let's look at our graph on the left here. Now, you may think that based on these characteristics, perfectly competitive markets and firms are probably just theoretical. I mean, there really is no great or perfect example of an industry in which there are thousands of sellers with identical costs selling identical products. but I can come up with at least one decent example based on these characteristics. Here in Switzerland, we are known for our dairy products. We are known for our cheeses and our chocolate and the delicious milk that we can buy very cheaply at the grocery store. Now, where do milk, cheese, yogurt, and chocolate come from? Ultimately, they come from cows. The market for milk from cows in Switzerland shows many of the characteristics of perfect competition. There are about 15,000 dairy farmers in Switzerland selling tons and tons and tons of milk every day. Now, the price that one farmer can sell its milk for is determined not by that one farmer, rather it is determined by the market as a whole. So if we look at this graph on the left and think of this as the market for raw milk in Switzerland, we'll see that there is a price, an equilibrium price in the market for raw milk that is determined based on the supply, which consists of thousands, we'll say 15,000 farmers. That's approximately how many dairy farmers there are in Switzerland. The total quantity of milk produced in Switzerland in a given day is a function of the supply of milk from those 15,000 farmers and the demand from all of the milk processors that turn that milk into other products. We'll just call that QE. So we can see in our graph on the left that the supply and the demand for milk in Switzerland as a whole determines the equilibrium price of milk in Switzerland. Now, if we look at an individual dairy farmer or one firm in this perfectly competitive market, we can see that the marginal cost represents, in a way, this individual dairy farmer's supply curve. So this represents the individual supply curve of one of the 15,000 dairy farmers in Switzerland. Now, we're assuming that the thousands of dairy farmers in Switzerland share a tiny percentage of the total market for raw milk in Switzerland. Therefore, that one dairy farmer, this one dairy farmer, cannot set his own price for milk. If this dairy farmer tried to charge a price that was any higher than the equilibrium price determined in the market, this dairy farmer would not sell any milk because there are 14,999 other dairy farmers selling their milk at the equilibrium price. On the other hand, if one dairy farmer tried to sell his milk at any price lower than the equilibrium price, every single buyer of milk would want to buy milk from that one dairy farmer. So based on what I just explained, based on the fact that any increase in price would lead to an infinite decrease in the quantity demanded, while any decrease in price would lead to nearly an infinite increase in the quantity demanded, that sounds to me like the demand for an individual dairy farmer's milk is perfectly elastic. And in fact, that is the case. The demand for one dairy farmer's milk is going to be perfectly elastic or horizontal at the equilibrium price determined by the market. So here we have an individual dairy farmer's demand curve. So this is the demand for one individual dairy farmer's milk. It is perfectly elastic, meaning that this dairy farmer has no control over the price of his milk. If he raises his price, he will sell 0 liters of milk. If he lowers his price, every single buyer will want to buy if this one farmer lowers his price. Basically, what we're going to see is that an individual dairy farmer cannot raise or lower his price. Therefore, the price is determined by the market, as we see here. This is not only the demand. In fact, this also represents the marginal revenue. MR stands for marginal revenue. One dairy farmer can sell as much milk as he wants at the equilibrium price of PE. If this dairy farmer wanted to sell, let's say this is 1,000 liters, the price he would be able to charge for those 1,000 liters is PE. On the other hand, if he wanted to sell 5,000 liters, he could sell that for a price of PE. In other words, if this dairy farmer increases his output or decreases his output, it has no effect on the market price. He is such a small player in the whole market for raw milk in Switzerland that even if he increases his output 5-fold, there will be no effect on the market price. There are still 14,999 other farmers out there producing milk, so his change in output does not do enough to increase or decrease the market supply of milk to change the actual price of milk. So we've now shown that the demand for an individual, perfectly competitive firm's output is perfectly elastic, and it is horizontal at the equilibrium price determined in the market. So this is the price of milk right here at PE. It also represents the firm's marginal revenue, which is, let's define marginal revenue here. This is the change in total revenue attributable to a particular change in quantity. So when the dairy farmer increases his output from 5,000 liters to 5,001 liters, his total revenue will change by the price per liter that is determined by the market. In other words, his marginal revenue is equal to the price determined by the market. We've now got our individual perfectly competitive firms' demand curve. It is just a horizontal line equal to the equilibrium price determined by the market. So the next question is, what is the optimal quantity of milk for an individual dairy farmer to produce based on the marginal revenue determined by the market and the marginal costs determined by the firm's productivity of labor and other variable resources in the short run? We're going to now introduce what is called the profit maximization rule. In order for a firm to maximize its profits in the short run, it should produce at the quantity at which the firm's marginal revenue equals its marginal cost. We're going to explain why this is the optimal profit maximizing level of output in just a moment, but for now let's look at our graph and identify the quantity that this individual firm will wish to produce at to maximize its profits. It's clearly right here at the intersection of MC and MR. At this intersection, the firm will wish to stop producing milk. It will wish to produce milk up to this quantity, which we'll call QPM for the profit maximizing quantity, but not beyond that quantity. Let me explain why this is the profit maximizing quantity of milk for this dairy farmer to produce. Let's say, for example, that the dairy farmer is producing at a point right here on its marginal cost curve. It is only producing, let's see, 4,000 liters. At this quantity, the marginal cost to the dairy farmer is $2. The dairy farmer's marginal cost, the cost of the last liter of milk that the dairy farmer produced, is $2. However, the price at which the dairy farmer is selling its milk per liter is $5. This indicates that on the last liter of milk that this dairy farmer produced, he earned a profit of $3. Now that sounds pretty good. You're earning a $3 profit on the last liter of milk that you produced. But what would happen if this dairy farmer increased his production to 5,000 liters? We would move up along the marginal cost curve, and output would increase to 5,000 liters. Marginal cost would increase to $3. So the last liter of milk that this farmer produced cost him $3, and he was able to sell it for, you guessed it, $5. This farmer is still earning a profit on the margin of $2. So the question is, should he have increased his output from 4,000 to 5,000 liters? Clearly, his total profits increased as his output increased from 4 to 5,000 liters because he still earned a profit of $2 as he increased his output to 5,000 liters. So there was no harm in increasing his output, therefore it was a good decision to do so. So now he's going to determine whether or not he should increase his output to 6,000 liters. So let's see what happens to costs and revenues on the margin as output increases again to 6,000 liters. So here we see that at 6,000 liters the marginal cost rises yet again. Marginal cost increases as quantity increases due to the law of diminishing marginal returns. In fact, marginal cost is now around $4.50 for the last liter of milk produced. Yes, of course, he's still earning a profit. If we zoom in really close here, we can see there's still a profit of 50 cents, even on the 6,000th liter of milk. Now, as we see here, the profits continue to increase for milk production until you get to the point where, and I'll call it QPM again, the marginal cost equals the marginal revenue. For each additional liter of milk up to that point, this dairy farmer's profits increase. But what happens if this dairy farmer produces 7,000 liters of milk? Let's look at a quantity out here at 7,000 beyond QPM. at 7,000 liters, the marginal cost, the cost of the last liter produced, is greater than the revenue earned from the sale of the last liter. In fact, it's around $6.30. This indicates that on the margin, this firm lost $1.30. For that last liter produced, that 7,000th liter, the marginal cost of $6.30 exceeded the marginal revenue of $5 by $1.30. This was a bad decision. This firm should not have produced any more than the profit maximizing quantity of just over 6,000 liters, because every liter of milk produced beyond that QPM, the marginal cost exceeds the marginal revenue. Therefore, the change in the firm's total profits is negative. Its profits will decrease if the marginal cost exceeds the marginal revenue. So this brings us back to QPM. At QPM, let's look at that point more closely now. Right here at the intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue, this firm is maximizing its total profits. The firm cannot do any better than this. If it produces at a quantity below QPM, it can improve its total profits by increasing its output. However, if it's producing beyond QPM, it can increase its profits by decreasing total output. And that is because beyond QPM, the marginal cost is greater than the marginal revenue, indicating you're producing too much. Below QPM, the marginal cost is less than the marginal revenue, indicating you're producing too little. So that explains the profit maximization rule, which says that in order to maximize total profits, a firm in a perfectly competitive market, or as we're going to see, any market for that matter, should produce a quantity at which the marginal revenue, in other words, the revenue earned from the sale of the last unit, equals the marginal cost, which is the cost of producing the last unit. In this lesson, we have gone over how demand is determined for a perfectly competitive seller's output. It is determined by the price established in the market for that firm's output. In a market in which there are thousands of identical sellers facing identical costs, an individual firm has no control over the market price. Hence, the firms in perfectly competitive markets are price takers. We have not yet shown the level of economic profit that a firm will earn in the short run and in the long run in a perfectly competitive market. We will show that in a later video. But we have shown that in order to maximize its profits, or as we will see, minimize its losses, a perfectly competitive firm should produce up to the point where its marginal cost equals its marginal revenue. Anything beyond that, the firm can increase its profits by reducing output. Anything below that, a firm can increase its profits by increasing output. In our next lesson, we're going to add the average total cost and average variable cost curves to our perfectly competitive firm diagram to determine the level of economic profit that a firm is earning based on its average revenue and its average total cost, which would give us the per unit profit. And then we'll see what the implications of low entry barriers are to the likelihood of a perfectly competitive firm earning profits in the long run. In this video lesson, we're going to explore the concept of efficiency under perfect competition. The question we will be answering today is what makes perfectly competitive markets and the firms that compete in such markets both productively and allocatively efficient. This is a concept that is used regularly in economics classes to describe the benefits of a competitive market over a less competitive market, such as monopoly or oligopoly. In order to understand what makes less competitive markets inefficient, we first must understand what it is that makes perfectly competitive markets efficient. So this video is probably the final video in our perfect competition section of the syllabus. So if you haven't already, make sure you go back and watch the preceding videos before this one under perfect competition. Before we can illustrate and explain what makes perfectly competitive markets efficient, we first must define the two different measures of efficiency that we refer to in economics. So let's begin with the easier type of efficiency to understand. Let's look at productive efficiency and come up with a clear definition of what it means to be productively efficient. Productive efficiency refers to the use of resources in the production of goods and services. Productive efficiency is achieved when firms produce their output in the least cost manner. In other words, firms must produce at their minimum average total cost. Earlier in the course, we explained that the costs a firm faces are inversely related to the productivity of that firm's resources. This means that when a firm is achieving its minimum average total cost, the resources the firm employs are being used at their maximum efficiency. Nothing is going to waste when a firm is producing at its minimum average total cost. So productive efficiency occurs when the price of a good is equal to the minimum average total cost. In order to remain competitive in such a market, firms must achieve their minimum average total cost. So to determine whether a firm is achieving productive efficiency, we must ask the question, does the price of the firm's product equal the firm's minimum average total cost? When looking at a perfectly competitive firm in its long-run equilibrium, we can see that in fact price does equal minimum average total cost. So if we look at our graph here and we zoom in on the equilibrium level of output that this firm will produce in the long run at its MC equals MR point. This, as you may recall, is the profit maximizing level of output. At this level of output, we can see that the price is equal to the minimum average total cost. If the price that this firm could sell its output for were any higher, the firm would not have to produce at its productively efficient level of output. For instance, if the demand for this good were greater, this firm would increase the quantity of output that it produced from QF to Q1. Now, is this firm still achieving productive efficiency? It is clear that it is not. A firm in the short run may not be achieving productive efficiency if the price at which it can sell its goods for is greater than the long-run equilibrium price. The reason for that is that at this level of output, Q1, you can see that the firm is achieving an average total cost that is greater than the minimum average total cost. How do I know that this point right here is greater than the minimum point on ATC? Well, that's because we learned earlier in the course that the marginal cost curve intersects the average total cost curve at its lowest point. Therefore, at Q1, the firm is producing at a marginal cost that is greater than the minimum average total cost, implying that the firm is no longer productively efficient. So how do we know that a firm in perfect competition will always achieve its productively efficient level of output in the long run? The reason for that is that at MR1, which I've labeled here, and D1, this market is not in its long-run equilibrium. If the price that the firm could sell its output for was greater than its minimum average total cost, then new firms would be attracted to this market, increasing the market's supply and driving the price down until it equals the minimum average total cost. If economic profits are being earned in the short run, those profits will be eliminated in the long run, and the price will fall, forcing the firm to reduce its output back to the productively efficient level, where P equals minimum ATC. In fact, all perfectly competitive firms will achieve productive efficiency in the long run due to the nature of competition itself. Low barriers to entry mean that anytime firms earn economic profits and are able to produce at a productively inefficient level of output, new firms will be attracted to the market, forcing the price back down, forcing the existing firms to increase their productive efficiency until they have achieved their minimum average total cost. At this point, there is no way for this firm to become more efficient in its use of its resources. It is producing at its lowest possible average total cost. So that is productive efficiency. We know that firms in perfectly competitive markets will be productively efficient because in the long run, the price will equal the minimum average total cost in perfectly competitive markets. But productive efficiency is only one measure of efficiency. We also must ask the question, what makes perfectly competitive markets allocatively efficient? So next we're going to define allocative efficiency, which is a little bit more complex of a concept than productive efficiency. and then we're going to look at our diagram again and determine whether or not perfectly competitive firms and the markets in which they compete achieve allocative efficiency. First, let's define allocative efficiency. This refers to a situation in which the quantity being produced in the market allows for the greatest level of total welfare, meaning consumer and producer surplus, possible. An industry is allocatively efficient if there is no way that consumer and producer surplus can be increased by changing the level of output. Now, earlier in the course, we explained that consumer surplus refers to the total well-being of consumers who were willing and able to pay a higher price than the equilibrium price of the good in the market. Graphically, consumer surplus is indicated by the area of the triangle below the demand curve and above the equilibrium price in the market. This triangle outlined in yellow represents the consumer surplus in our market in the graph on the left. Producer surplus, on the other hand, referred to the total welfare of producers who were able to sell their product at a price greater than their cost of production. In other words, producers who would have been willing and able to sell their product at a lower price, but instead are able to sell it at the higher price of PE. Graphically, producer surplus is shown by the area below the equilibrium price and above the supply curve, the area I'm outlining in blue in our graph on the left. In our graph on the left, which shows a perfectly competitive market in its long-run equilibrium, we can see that consumer and producer surplus are maximized. The consumer surplus is the yellow triangle, the producer surplus is the blue triangle. Now, how do I know that a quantity of QE maximizes consumer and producer surplus? Well, let's put a different quantity on here and see what the effect on consumer and producer surplus would be. For example, let's choose a quantity Q1 and indicate the effect that a lower quantity would have on total consumer and producer surplus and therefore total welfare in this market. If this industry were only producing Q1 units of output, we can see that the demand for Q1 is greater than the supply of Q1. Now, earlier in the course, we explained that the demand curve on a graph represents the marginal benefit of consumers in that market, whereas the supply curve represents the marginal costs of producers in that market. So at a quantity of Q1, we can see that the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost in this industry. This means that resources are under-allocated towards this good. At Q1, society benefits more than it costs the producers of this good to produce the good. We would all be better off if a greater quantity was produced. If we produced at QE, the marginal benefit would diminish due to the law of diminishing marginal utility. We would see that the additional benefit consumers get from more and more output of this good would decline. However, the marginal cost would increase to producers due to the law of diminishing marginal returns. Producers' marginal costs would rise, and the two would converge on the equilibrium point. So only right here at our equilibrium point is the marginal benefit enjoyed by consumers of the good equal to the marginal cost imposed on producers of the good. This is the allocatively efficient level of output. So what would happen if production occurred at a level of output beyond QE? Wouldn't society be better off with more of everything? You may think so. However, at some point, if we look out here at Q2, we can see that the cost to producers of achieving a quantity of Q2 is greater than the benefit enjoyed by consumers of having the quantity Q2. In other words, this level of output is allocatively inefficient because the marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefit. Society has overproduced the good at a quantity of Q2, and society has underproduced the good at a quantity of Q1. Only at QE is society efficiently producing this good. This is what we call the socially optimal quantity of output. Where marginal benefit equals marginal cost, society has achieved an allocatively efficient or socially optimal level of output. Anything less than that and resources are under-allocated towards the good. Anything more than that and resources are over-allocated towards the good. So looking back at our definition of allocative efficiency, we can say that it is achieved when marginal benefit equals marginal cost. Now, in an individual firm diagram, there is no marginal benefit curve. However, there is a demand curve, and demand represents marginal benefit. In the individual firm diagram, we can determine whether or not allocative efficiency is achieved by looking at whether the price equals the marginal cost in the long run. So we can also say that when price equals marginal cost, a firm is being allocatively efficient. So I'm going to clean up the graph here, and we're going to do an analysis of allocative efficiency in both the market and the firm diagram here to explain why perfectly competitive firms are always allocatively efficient. Let's look at our individual firm graph on the right. What makes firms in perfectly competitive markets allocatively efficient? In other words, why do firms in perfect competition produce where P equals MC? That's what we're going to look at here. Does the marginal cost that the firm achieves equal the price, which is a signal of marginal benefit? Notice that the demand curve for a perfectly competitive firm's output is horizontal at the equilibrium price in the market. So we can see this demand curve is also representing the marginal benefit that consumers get from the good being sold. Since an individual firm will always wish to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, we can also see that this is the allocatively efficient level of output, because in perfect competition, marginal revenue equals the price. Firms are price takers. They can sell as much of this good as they want to at the equilibrium price. For that reason, the change in total revenue of increasing its output by 1 unit will always be the price. The marginal revenue, in other words, is always equal to the price in perfect competition. And in fact, this is only true in perfect competition. We will see that in other market structures, the marginal revenue of a particular level of output is always lower than what the firm can charge for that unit of output. Therefore, in other market structures, allocative efficiency will not necessarily be achieved. But in perfect competition, because the marginal revenue equals the price, and because firms will always wish to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, the result is price will always equal marginal cost under perfect competition. Now, what if firms were not profit maximizers in perfectly competitive markets? What if this individual firm chose to produce at a level of output less than its profit maximizing level? For example, at Q1. If this were to occur, we can see that this firm would no longer be maximizing its economic profits. In fact, it would be earning economic losses. This is clearly not a desirable level of output for the individual firm. And we can also see that the price is now greater than the marginal cost, since marginal cost is right here and the price is still up here. Now, why is this allocatively inefficient? Well, if this firm were producing at a lower level of output and there were 1,000 firms identical to this one in the market, none of them producing at their profit maximizing level, then in our market diagram, there would certainly be an under-allocation of resources towards this good. We can see that if individual firms were producing at a quantity of Q1, the total output in this market would be at a lower quantity as well, less than QE. So I'll put a point of Q1 in our market diagram, and let's see the effect that this lower level of output has on allocative efficiency in the market. Here we see that if the price of this good were PE, yet the quantity that firms were producing at were Q1, then the marginal benefit that consumers get of Q1 is greater than the marginal cost imposed on producers at Q1. The total sum of consumer and producer surplus is less than what is achievable if output were at QE. This is an allocatively inefficient level of output because total welfare is less than what it could be if output were at a greater quantity. Total welfare at Q1 is equal to the green area in our graph on the left. However, If individual firms were producing at their profit maximizing level of output where the price equals the marginal cost, there would be a gain in total welfare of the yellow triangle. So only at QE is total welfare maximized. If firms produce at any level of output besides where the price equals the marginal cost, total welfare will be reduced in this market, and we have to say that that therefore is allocatively inefficient. So Q1, resources are under allocated towards this good. Society would be better off with the greater quantity of output because total welfare, the sum of consumer and producer surplus, would be increased by the yellow triangle in our graph. Now, if firms were to produce at a level of output beyond the profit maximizing level, we would have the same problem. If firms produced at Q2, which is not their profit maximizing level, you can see that the marginal cost is now much greater than the price. Resources are now over allocated. In our market diagram, we could put a point of Q2 and show that too much would be produced in this market if firms did not produce at their profit maximizing level. The marginal cost to the firms in the market is now greater than the marginal benefit enjoyed by consumers. So allocative efficiency requires that firms produce where the price equals their marginal cost of production. At any level of output greater or less than that quantity, resources will either be over allocated or under allocated towards the production of the good in the market as a whole. But since firms are interested in maximizing their profits, they should always produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And since marginal revenue equals price under perfect competition, this will also be allocatively efficient. So this lesson went through two different types of efficiency. Productive efficiency, which requires that firms will produce at their minimum average total cost in the long run, and allocative efficiency, which requires that firms will produce where their marginal cost equals the price of the good. Both of these conditions are met under perfect competition in the long run. Due to the fact that barriers to entry are very low, if profits exist and firms are inefficient in the short run, they will be forced to be efficient once again due to the entrance of new firms and the increased competition driving prices down to the minimum average total cost. Firms interested in maximizing their profits will always wish to produce where their marginal revenue equals their marginal cost, which under perfect competition will always be where price equals marginal cost. Hence, firms are both productively and allocatively efficient in perfect competition. In a later lesson, we will examine less competitive market structures, such as monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly, and illustrate what makes those market structures less efficient, both productively and allocatively, than perfect competition. In this video lesson, we're going to examine efficiency in different market structures. So this is going to be the final lesson in a series of lessons on what we call theory of the firm, in which we examine the competitive behavior of firms in market structures ranging from perfect competition to pure monopoly. In this lesson, we're going to examine firms in three different market structures: the perfectly competitive firm in the graph on the left, the pure monopolist in the graph on the middle, and the monopolistic competitor in the graph on the right. Before you watch this lesson, you should have watched all the video lessons in which we introduce these three market structures, and we introduce the diagrams that illustrate individual competitors in these three market structures. So before we get into our discussion about whether or not firms in these different industries are efficient, we must first define what is meant by efficiency. So there are actually two types of efficiency that can be determined in economics. The first type is known as productive efficiency. To determine whether a firm is productively efficient, we must determine whether or not that firm is producing in the least cost manner. In other words, do firms in the industry produce at the quantity at which their average total cost is at its lowest point? Sometimes this type of efficiency is referred to as technical efficiency, indicating that the firm is producing its goods in the most efficient way possible, minimizing its average total costs in the process. Productive efficiency assures that the goods price will be equal to the minimum average total cost of the firms in the industry. If the price that the firm can sell its output for is at anything greater than the minimum average total cost, then firms in an industry do not have an incentive to be productively efficient. They don't need to produce at the lowest average total cost if they can sell their good at a price higher than that. So when we look at the three firms here, we'll look at whether or not the price is equal to the minimum average total cost. The second type of efficiency is a slightly more abstract concept known as allocative efficiency. Allocative efficiency relates to the quantity of output in the industry and whether or not it is the socially optimal quantity. Now, from previous units, we learned that socially optimal quantity is achieved when the equilibrium output in a market occurs at the intersection of marginal cost and marginal benefit. Now, we don't generally draw a marginal benefit curve on an individual firm diagram. However, we always draw a demand curve. And you'll recall from earlier in the course that demand represents the marginal benefit that consumers receive from the consumption of a good. So to determine whether or not a firm and the industry in which that firm competes is achieving allocative efficiency, we must determine whether or not marginal benefit equals marginal cost at the quantity at which the firms are producing. Another way of looking at this is to determine whether or not the price that the good is selling for is equal to the firm's marginal cost, since price represents the marginal benefits that consumers receive from the good. So let's begin our analysis now. Let's start by drawing some cost curves, some demand curves, some marginal revenue curves on each of these three graphs. Now we're going to illustrate each of these markets in its long-run equilibrium state, meaning that there is no reason for firms to enter or exit the market given the current level of economic profits that the firms in the industry are achieving. So you'll recognize the shapes of these curves as I draw them. You'll notice that demand for a monopolist product is downward sloping, indicating that the monopolist has price making power and that it is producing a unique product that no other firm is producing. You'll also notice that a perfectly competitive demand curve is horizontal, indicating that the firm is a price taker and must accept the price determined in the market for its product. The monopolistic competitor is one of several firms producing similar products, but it does have some price making power. So demand is downward sloping, but generally speaking, it's more elastic since there are more substitutes than the demand for a monopolist's output. Marginal revenue will also be less steep than it is for the monopolist. So let's label all of these curves. In the perfectly competitive market, we can see that the demand curve corresponds with the marginal revenue, the revenue the firm earns for the sale of each additional unit. Now this is determined by the price, which of course is established in the market for the good, in which there are hundreds or maybe even thousands of identical firms producing an identical product. The monopolist demand curve, downward sloping, has a marginal revenue curve that lies below it. Because the firm is a price maker, it must lower its price to sell additional units. For this reason, marginal revenue will always be lower than the price that the firm has sold its output for. The monopolistic competitor looks very similar to the monopolist. However, demand tends to be more elastic since there are more substitutes. So there's our demand and marginal revenue curves. The next thing we need is our cost curves. I'm going to assume that each of these firms in each market structure faces similar costs, since we want to hold all else equal when determining whether or not a firm in an industry is allocatively or productively efficient. Finally, we must add our average total cost curves. Now remember, I said we're going to show each of these industries and the firms in the industries in long-run equilibrium. A perfect competitor in long-run equilibrium will earn zero economic profits, indicating that it will be producing where price equals average total cost. So our average total cost curve will look like this, and our monopolist will draw a similar average total cost curve. And in the case of a monopolistic competitor, firms in the long run will break even, indicating that average total cost will be tangent to the demand curve in the long run. If the average total cost were lower than demand in the long run, then firms would enter the market and demand would decrease for each individual firm. All of this was explained in previous video lessons. Now, recall that the profit maximization rule, we're assuming that all of these firms are profit maximizing, indicating that they're going to produce where their marginal cost is equal to their marginal revenue. So we just need to find the intersection of the MC and MR curves in all of these graphs and identify that as the equilibrium quantity. I'll label this the perfectly competitive quantity. And over here we've got marginal cost and marginal revenue. This is the monopolist quantity. To find the price the monopolist can charge, we go up to the demand curve and over. And the monopolistic competitor's quantity, where MC equals MR. And the price above, found by going up to the demand curve. Let's go ahead and label the average total costs of each of these firms as well. We can see that the monopolist's average total cost is slightly lower than its price, indicating that the firm is earning economic profits. Now, this is possible because of the high barriers to entry in a monopolistic market. The monopolistic competitor, on the other hand, charges a price that's exactly equal to its average total cost. The reason the monopolistic competitor will not earn economic profits, as you will recall, is that there are low barriers to entry, so any profits that may have been earned in the short run were eliminated as new competitors entered the market and drove down the price. Notice, however, that for the perfect competitor, price is equal to average total cost as well, indicating that the perfect competitor is only going to break even in the long run. So we'll shade our area of economic profit for the monopolist, as is customary. And now we're ready to begin analyzing the degree of efficiency achieved in each of these three markets. So again, we need to look at the relationship between the price of the good in the market and the firm's average total cost, and the price of the good and the firm's marginal cost. If the price is equal to the minimum average total cost, then we know that the firms in a market are achieving productive efficiency. Since any cost higher than the minimum ATC will result in economic losses. Therefore, firms must produce at their lowest average total cost. Similarly, if we look at the relationship between price and marginal cost, we can determine whether or not the firms in the industry are allocatively efficient. Because if the price is any greater than the marginal cost, then we know that the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, and therefore resources are under-allocated towards the good. This would be a form of market failure, in fact. So let's begin with productive efficiency. All we're going to do now is look at each of these three graphs and ask the question, does the price equal the firm's minimum average total cost? We'll start with perfect competition. Here we can see that in the long-run equilibrium, in fact, the price equals the minimum average total cost. The reason for this, of course, is the fact that there are no barriers to entry and that each firm is producing an identical product. If the price were any higher than the minimum ATC, then the firms would be earning profits and new firms would be attracted to the market, reducing the demand seen by each individual firm and eliminating those profits until the point where the price equals the minimum average total cost. So, perfect competition achieves productive efficiency. We can see that by the fact that the price will equal the minimum average total cost. Let's move on to monopoly. Does the price, as we can see here, equal the minimum ATC? In fact, it's quite clear that it does not. Now, the minimum average total cost, of course, is found where the marginal cost curve intersects the average total cost curve. So here we can see that the minimum ATC is quite a bit lower than the actual price in the market. So price is greater than minimum ATC for the monopolist, indicating that the monopolist will not achieve productive efficiency. The rational, logical explanation for this is quite simple. When a single firm is the only producer of a product, there's no competition in that market. Without competition, there is no reason for the firm to produce in the most efficient or least cost manner. The lack of competition allows the firm to charge a higher price than it would if there was more competition. The higher price allows the firm to produce at an average total cost that is higher than its minimum average total cost. We can see that here. The firm's actual ATC is greater than its minimum ATC at the profit maximizing quantity of QM. Productive efficiency is not achieved by monopolistic firms. Let's move on to monopolistic competition. Looking at the monopolistically competitive firm, it might appear at first glance that in fact the firm is productively efficient. However, this would be a mistake. While the firm's price actually equals its average total cost at the profit maximizing quantity, it does not equal the minimum average total cost. Recall that ATC is minimized where marginal cost equals ATC. So the minimum ATC is found by going from the lowest point on the ATC curve over. And there's our minimum ATC. So in fact, the price is greater than the minimum ATC, indicating that the firm is productively inefficient. Despite the fact that the firm's price is equal to its average total cost, it is not equal to its minimum average total cost. So while these firms will only break even in the long run, they will not necessarily achieve productive efficiency. So of the three market structures we've looked at here, only perfectly competitive firms will achieve productive efficiency in the long run. Because there are barriers to entry and because the products produced by imperfect competitors are slightly differentiated, or in the case of a monopolist, totally differentiated from any other firm's output, the firms in these markets will not be forced to achieve productive efficiency due to the lack of competition and the barriers to entry that exist. So let's move on to allocative efficiency now. Do producers in each of these markets achieve allocative efficiency? Start with our perfect competitor. Here we can see that at the profit maximizing quantity of QPC, the firm's price is equal to its marginal cost. We can say that the perfect competitor is allocatively efficient. With free entry and exit from a market, perfectly competitive markets in the long run will achieve a level of output at which the supply equals the demand. The marginal cost of the producers in the industry equals the marginal benefit that consumers receive from the good. This is what we call the socially optimal quantity. Perfect competitors are allocatively efficient. Moving on to monopoly. Does the price of the good equal the marginal cost? Well, to find out what the firm's marginal cost is at a quantity of QM, we must go up to its marginal cost curve and draw a dotted line over. We can see here that the marginal cost is much, much lower than the price, indicating that resources are underallocated towards the monopolist's output. Now this makes sense. If there's only one firm producing a good, that firm has no incentive to produce the socially optimal amount of that good. The goal of individual firms is not to maximize social benefit or social welfare, it's to maximize their own profits. And they do that insofar as that they can restrict the output in the market to a quantity at which the price is higher and at which the price is higher than their average total cost. In other words, they're earning profits. We can see on this graph what the socially optimal quantity would be. It would be where the demand equals the marginal cost. It would be right here. So the socially optimal quantity is where demand equals marginal cost. We can see, however, that the monopolist is not going to produce that. They're going to produce at a lower quantity, charge a higher price to maximize their profits. Monopolists are allocatively inefficient. Not enough of a monopolist's output will be produced, at least according to what is socially optimal. Finally, let's look at monopolistic competition. Does the monopolistic competitor achieve allocative efficiency? The answer is no. We can go up to the marginal cost curve, draw a dotted line over, and we can see that the price is greater than the marginal cost. The monopolistic competitor is not achieving allocative efficiency for the same reason that the monopolist is not. As long as firms have some price making power, as long as firms face a downward sloping demand curve, they will choose to produce at a quantity that is less than where marginal benefit equals marginal cost, or where demand equals marginal cost. They will restrict their output in order to maximize their profits. So let's do a recap of what we've looked at today. We have defined productive efficiency and we have defined allocative efficiency. We have examined perfect competition and imperfect competition. We have seen that only in the case of perfectly competitive industries will both allocative and productive efficiency be achieved. Only when there are no barriers to entry and when the products being produced are identical to each other, when all the characteristics of perfect competition are met, we will achieve the socially optimal quantity of output where society's marginal benefit equals the marginal costs of the producers in the industry. In addition, only in perfect competition will firms be required to produce at their lowest average total cost in order just to break even. If firms have any price-making power whatsoever, as in the case of monopolists and monopolistic competitors, they will choose to produce less than the socially optimal quantity in order to maximize their own profits. In the process, these firms are not required to produce at their minimum average total cost, indicating that imperfectly competitive markets are both allocative and productively inefficient. Now this might remind you of something we studied much earlier in the course called market failure. In fact, imperfect competition represents a type of market failure, since resources will ultimately be under-allocated towards the goods produced in imperfectly competitive markets. In reality, most markets are imperfectly competitive. There are very few examples of perfectly competitive markets in this world. Does this mean that most markets are market failures? Well, that kind of depends on your perspective. If you look purely at the relationship between marginal benefit and marginal cost, then yes, technically speaking, most industries are market failures. However, there are many benefits not considered when we make that conclusion. For example, imperfectly competitive firms have a strong incentive to differentiate their product. They often do this through customer service or through innovation or through product development, which actually benefits consumers. If the world consisted of industries that were all perfectly competitive, there would be no variety for consumers to choose from, and everybody would wear the same clothes and drive the same cars, even have the same haircuts. This is not the kind of world we want to live in. Imperfect competition, while it is technically inefficient and allocatively inefficient, actually provides many benefits for consumers in the form of innovation, product variety, customer service, and other benefits that we derive from the competitive nature of monopolistic competitors. That wraps up this lesson on efficiency in different market structures.